Is there a fundamental problem with air traffic control in the United States?
The Trump White House is firing hundreds of air traffic controllers at the FAA.
This country's air traffic control system is unsustainable. It's unsustainable.
How serious are the shortages and what kind of role do they play in the recent incidents and accidents that we have been seeing? In this video, I'm going to try to answer these questions and also look at how or if these problems are being solved right now. Stay tuned. Many of you have in the comments here below recently been asking me if something is changing in the world of aviation, if there is something causing the high number of incidents and accidents that we're seeing, especially in the United States. Well, I made a recent video to try to answer that exact question, and there I pointed out that there isn't really any identifiable common links between these accidents that would point to a specific trend, and I stand by that argument. But those of you that follow aviation closely and have been following this channel for a bit longer, you probably know that questions around this topic go way back longer than just the past few months. In 2023, for example, I made another video focusing more specifically on various close calls in several airports in the United States. And those involved runway incursions and other events that brought aircraft way too close to each other. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was actually another one of those, involving a Southwest Boeing 737 that had to reject a landing due to a crossing business jet. So, inevitably, these events do raise the question, what role does air traffic control play in all of this? Now, before I go any further, I know that many of you already know this, but I need to emphasize it for everybody in this case. There are no easy answers here. It is easy to point fingers and say that A or B was at fault, but aviation accidents almost never happen because of one single cause. In the over 100 years that commercial aviation has been active, we've been learning from accidents and incidents and have built layer upon layer of protections. This goes for both our technical systems, our training, and of course our procedures, and this has evolved not only to prevent mistakes, but also to catch them when they inevitably happen, because they will always continue to happen. That is actually what I mean when I talk about Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model. Our systems and procedures are created so that in order for an accident to happen, many things have to occur in just the wrong order. Let me also take this time to honor Dr. James Reason, who passed away recently. His contribution to aviation safety just cannot be overstated. Thank you, Doctor. Rest in peace. Anyway, the reason I just mentioned is why accident investigation almost always mention multiple causes for each accident, usually also with even more contributing factors on top of those. And the issues related to air traffic control might be just one out of all of those factors. All of that being said though, it's only natural for investigators to examine the role of air traffic control every time something happens in the airport environment, especially when more than one aircraft is involved, which obviously is why there is so much scrutiny on air traffic control after these runway incursions. Now, before we look for any recent changes in the job that air traffic controllers do, let's take a closer look at what the job actually involves. I know that many people think that controllers are just those people sitting in the tower talking to pilots who are about to take off on land, but that's just one out of the roles that controllers have. There are also ground controllers who are talking to aircraft taxiing around the airport, and depending on the airport size, they could also have separate ground controllers handling traffic that's closer to the terminals and parking aprons, and others that are handling aircraft out on the taxiways. And that's only the positions at the airport. Then there are also controller positions for aircraft on approach and departure, and these controllers may or may not be located at the airport themselves. And on top of that, we also have en route centers with even more controllers handling traffic that's en route, as their name suggests. These are all seriously demanding jobs. When they're not sitting high up in a tower, a lot of controllers have to work in somewhat dark rooms to help them see their screens a bit more clearly, and that's despite modern computers now being much better than the old radar scopes were. Modern computers are also much better at highlighting potential traffic conflict, but despite this, air traffic controllers obviously need to stay alert and recognize such problems before they happen, and ensuring that can be easier said than done. The controllers also have to work shifts, and just like pilots, they have strict limits on how long they can work. The shifts can't be any longer than 10 hours, for example, but there are also several requirements for breaks and frequent changes in positions during each shift in order to help them stay focused and alert. They then need a minimum of 9 hours of rest between their shifts, and obviously these shifts could be happening during both day or night, not to mention weekends and vacation periods, just like for us pilots. On top of this is also a job that really depends on people staying sharp, which is one of the reasons why the FAA still mandates that air traffic controllers must retire at the age of 56 in the United States. Again, these are seriously demanding jobs, in addition to being safety critical, and unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be enough people around to fill these jobs today. Now, there are some disagreement between different sources here regarding how big the shortage of US ATC personnel actually is, but it seems to be in the region of 3,500 to 3,800 positions. That's out of an FAA target of 14,600 controllers, according to the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, or NATCA. Now, these shortages mean that many existing controllers are right now working 6-day weeks with 10-hour workdays, and even with that, it's still not enough to fill all of those empty slots. Now, there is also an option for one controller to handle 2 positions simultaneously, like tower and ground, depending on the workload and other additional limitations. And that was a detail that got more publicity recently because the controller handling the CRJ-700 and the helicopter during that fateful mid-air collision over the Potomac River in DC was staffing 2 different jobs at that time. But obviously, we don't know if that played any part in what actually happened. That's why we have to wait for the final report. But CNN reported that the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport has 28 controller positions, of which 24 were staffed during the accident, which obviously got plenty of media attention. I really wish that the press would allow the air accident investigators to speak before even considering pointing blame in any one direction, but that's just me. Anyway, so why are there such shortages of air traffic controllers in the United States then? Well, the nature of the job, as I've just explained, is one of those problems, but some peculiarities of the country's airlines also have a lot to do with it. And I'll tell you why that is and what is being done about it after this. Now, before I continue, I want to ask you all a question. Have you ever traveled abroad just to find out how insanely expensive data roaming can be? Well, I have, and I hope you never have to. We've all gotten used to having access to mobile internet everywhere we go nowadays, but when you travel, that might not always be the case, unless you prepare for it. And that's where today's sponsor, Saily, comes in. Saily is a fantastic eSIM app from the creators behind NordVPN, and with its help, you can access affordable mobile internet in over 150 different countries without the hassle of having to get a new physical SIM card. I always use Saily when I'm traveling to Dubai, for example, and it's super easy to use. You just download the app, find the plan that suits you, download and then activate the plan. And the tip is to activate it before pushing back at your origin airport. That way, you will always have internet available from the moment that you land. Now, Saily works flawlessly on both iOS and Android, and they offer 24/7 support everywhere you go. So if you want to stay connected without any hassle when you travel, use this QR code or go to saily.com/mentor now and use the code mentor now. That will give you an awesome 15% off your first purchase, and it will support us as well. So again, that's saily.com/mentor now with the code mentor now. Thank you, Saily. Now let's continue the story. The lack of adequate numbers of air traffic controllers isn't actually a new problem for the FAA. What is relatively new, though, is the way that some airlines have organized their networks in recent years. When much of the aviation industry grounded to a halt in 2020, some airlines, the ones that still had a bit of cash in their pockets, saw an opportunity. These were the likes of Southwest Airlines and Spirit, for example, and they used this void to try and fill the gap left by some other carriers by moving into new destinations. Now, these airlines obviously still flew less than before 2020, but their network was suddenly broader, and they did this with the hope of establishing themselves in these new destinations when the demand for travel returned. Now, for air traffic control, this wasn't really a problem during 2020 and 2021 because overall traffic levels were still way lower than usual, but predicting the ramp up that came later towards the end of 2022 and especially in 2023 now became really difficult. You see, the FAA couldn't just use pre-pandemic estimates to place the right amount of controllers in the right positions because that was no longer representative of where the airlines were actually flying. So, new players and expanded traffic in certain airports is one thing, but that is only one part of the story because these ATC shortages actually go way back to even before 2020. This is how these numbers have evolved since 2011, again according to NATCA. Now I should point out here that the scale of this graph makes this drop in numbers seem much steeper than it actually is, but why is there a drop of controllers in the first place? Well, the answer is because that's what the FAA chose to do, at least in part, and also what they had to do. Over the last couple of decades, the FAA and other aviation authorities around the world have been developing new initiatives like the Next Generation Air Transportation System, NextGen. This is an ongoing project, or actually a group of projects aimed at modernizing the management of airspace with various digital tools and improve awareness for pilots and controllers. For example, ADS-B, which uses GPS data to provide accurate positioning for aircraft, was largely standardized through NextGen. And another cool thing that is being developed through this initiative is trajectory-based operations, or TBOs. This is a system that will allow our aircraft flight management computers to basically talk directly with air traffic control, informing controllers exactly when we will reach every point in our flight, and that will enable the controllers to then sequence our approaches without having us placed into holds, which is just wasting time and fuel. The point that I want to make with this is that these systems will enable air traffic control systems to handle more capacity, or to allow fewer controllers in order to maintain the same capacity, with each controller then handling more traffic. So, going back to that drop in air traffic control staffing from 2012 and onwards. Cuts in the US federal budget around that time actually forced the FAA to accelerate its plans to operate with fewer people.
The FAA makes drastic cuts due to sequestration.
But there was also another reason for that sudden drop in air traffic controller numbers at that time. You see, a lot of existing controllers came up for retirement all at the same time because years earlier they had all been hired at the very same time. Back in 1983, US President Ronald Reagan fired nearly all air traffic controllers in the United States, almost 13,000 people, during a bitter strike that was declared illegal. So 9,000 new controllers were then hired to replace them, and 30 years later, voila, they were all up for retirement. And today, training standards for new air traffic controllers are a little bit more demanding than they were back then. The process to vet, select, train and qualify somebody from the street as an air traffic controller takes a long time, around 3 years, which is actually longer than it can take to train as an airline pilot. That ATC training regime then also has a high attrition rate. According to NATCA, the FAA needs 2,000 qualified applicants to guarantee that they can fill the posts of 1,100 retirees. And that's because the attrition rate over those 3 years of training is nearly 50%. So in practice, hiring enough people to fill the FAA's ATC vacancies as existing controllers continue to retire could take as long as 8 to 9 years to do. But here maybe you are wondering, why is any of this a surprise? Surely the FAA knew the retirement timeline of those controllers who were hired back in the 1980s, and they should obviously also know how long it will take to train new ones. Also, it's not 2012 or 2013 now, it's more than a dozen years later, so why is this still a problem? Well, this brings me to something really big that happened in April of last year. The FAA's reauthorization. Basically a long-term funding plan for the agency worth $105 billion. At the time, much of the focus on this reauthorization had to do with the FAA's leadership and things like the way that the FAA would keep up with its oversight of Boeing, but funding and planning to hire more air traffic controllers was also a key part of this 1,000-page bill. Also, this bill meant that from then on, the FAA wouldn't make its own decision on how many air traffic controllers it would need. Instead, the agency will have to abide by the recommendations of an external working group. And it was actually that group that came up with the FAA's current target of 14,800 controllers. Before that, the FAA only wanted around 12,000 or so. Now, at this point, I want to point out something which I'm sure some of you have already noticed. Ronald Reagan fired more controllers in 1983, around 13,000 of them, than the FAA has in total today. And in my view, that is pretty amazing. For reference, this is how the fleets of the 4 largest airlines in the United States have grown in that same period. Now, obviously, technology development since the 1980s, even before ADS-B and others, have been quite substantial. And also, ATC at smaller airports didn't necessarily have luxuries like radar, etc., which makes comparisons with today, I guess, a little bit unfair. But there is yet another factor to take into account here. One that also has to do with the fleets of airlines in the United States and that really dictates the workload that the air traffic controllers have. And that is the way that Delta, American and United Airlines are splitting their operations between mainline and regional flights. In order to illustrate this, let's have another look at American Airlines Flight 5342, that CRJ 700 who suffered that tragic mid-air collision with a helicopter over Washington a while back. This was a regional flight that was operated by American's wholly owned subsidiary, PSA. But to non-American viewers watching this, who might interpret the word regional in its literal sense, that regional distinction might seem a little bit strange. This flight originated in Wichita, Kansas, and lasted about 2 hours and 45 minutes, basically spanning around half the width of the continental United States. So, why was this called a regional flight? Well, the answer might seem obvious to my US viewers, because this is a regional carrier, not a mainline one. And I'm not sure how many of my viewers in the US knows this split is kind of unique to the United States. Other airlines around the world also have regional arms, typically with smaller aircraft than their main fleets do, but they don't have the union scope clause rules that very rigidly defines what is and what isn't a regional flight. Now, I have covered this before, but if you've missed it, the scope clause is part of the contract between an airline and its pilot union, and it defines what and how many flights the airline can outsource to a regional carrier. These regionals make sense to the airlines because they can pay the pilots, cabin crew and other personnel considerably less than what they pay their mainline crews, thus saving money. The scope clauses limits the number of passenger seats these regional aircraft are allowed to have, the maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft, and each airline also has slightly different rules on other things, like which routes the regional planes can fly and the total number of aircraft that can be regionals compared to the mainline fleet. And something that's really worth highlighting here is that these regional fleets aren't just marginal compared to the airline's mainline fleet. Let's use United as an example. Earlier this year, this airline celebrated taking delivery of its 1,000th aircraft. Except that's not really correct, because these numbers only include mainline jets. United also is complemented by a further 460 regional jets operated by Commuter, GoJet, Mesa, Republic and SkyWest. American Airlines has similar numbers, with 981 planes in its mainline fleet, plus a further 600 regionals. Now, I should mention here that these numbers can be a bit misleading, because scope clause limits also mean that the airlines can't necessarily operate all of these regional planes at once. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this is a little bit of an oddball situation. Normally, the factor that decides what aircraft an airline would use for a given route is how popular that route is and how efficiently it can be operated. But instead here, on many domestic routes in the US, majors are operating smaller aircrafts which are less efficient. But again, this isn't really a problem for the airline, because they pay lower wages to their regional crews, and also flying 4 Embraer 175s daily between City A and City B instead of 2 737-800s or Airbus A320s means that the airline can offer more departure time options to their customers. And their customers will probably need those extra departure options, because another effect of this situation is that passengers in the United States have to fly more connecting flights between domestic routes than we do here in Europe. But all of this, the connecting flights and the smaller planes that needs to fly twice as often, mean that many more takeoff and landings are occurring, and therefore there is much more work for the air traffic controllers. Obviously, 4 Embraers arriving and departing are much more work for them than 2 737s or Airbus A320s, and I think that this is a low-hanging fruit opportunity to reduce work for busy airports. Just pay your crews better and start flying bigger and more efficient aircraft fewer times. Now, I actually did a video a few years back predicting the death of the regional model due to the pilot shortage. Now, I have to agree that that hasn't happened yet, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't. And if you think that maybe access to aircraft is a problem here, remember that if it turns out that Boeing and Airbus can't make more single aisles fast enough, well then Embraer makes bigger E-jets than the E175, which comes with more efficient engines too. And the one and only reason that they are not already being used in the US regionals today is again because of those scope clauses. Finally, as many of you know, I'm trying hard not to get into politics on this channel, but it is impossible to talk about this topic without also mentioning the recent firing of FAA personnel for cost-cutting purposes and the effects that this might have on air traffic control. To be clear, as we record this, it appears that the new US government retracted the buyout offers that it had sent to air traffic controllers in February, claiming that no controllers were lost in that exercise. But the FAA also oversees Boeing and other key companies, and we have talked about the need to oversee manufacturers more closely, so I'd be curious to know what other employees the FAA did lose. I would also like to point out 2 different things. Firstly, it seems highly likely that air traffic control in the United States will be split away from the FAA eventually, and then maybe turned into a separate, private organization with some airline involvement, similar to how Eurocontrol works here in Europe. Now, if that happens, it would be a potentially big disruption. So adding a cost-cutting exercise to the FAA before that could make that transition even harder. Aviation, and air traffic control in particular, is not an area where you want to move fast and break things, as the tech bros tend to put it. It would instead be wise to move with some caution here, since things that break in aviation normally breaks in bad ways. Secondly, I don't know about you, but as a pilot and a passenger, I want to know that all air traffic controllers are happy, competent people who like their jobs, enjoy the company of their co-workers, and feel rested and financially secure. So, in the current environment with uncertainty and random firings, I have a feeling this could have a really negative impact. And it definitely won't help to find new people that are willing to train into this demanding and crucial role. But what do you think? Let me know here in the comments below, and leave a like and subscribe when you're down there. Now, I don't know if you have already noticed it, but we have been working with some really awesome artists lately to create these posters. Now, as a thank you to everyone who are making this channel possible, we will be giving away 10 of these over on Patreon. So go and check out our latest Patreon post for that. And even if you turn out not to be one of those lucky 10 who gets one, we will offer great discounts for all of our members. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you liked it. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt. You're watching Mentour now, and I hope you will have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.